Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished professional from South Africa, Mr. Michael Lee. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Thank you. Michael is the founder of Innotivity Institute. He's a master of creativity and innovation coaching. He's also an innovation consultant. Michael has spent more than 2 decades of experience in the film and TV industry in the US, Europe, and Africa as a writer, script editor, director, and producer. And he's the founder of the Academy of Television and Screen Arts in Johannesburg. So, Michael, before we start talking about creativity and innovation coaching, tell me a little bit about the work you do at the Innotivity Institute.
So, thanks, Ashutosh. The Innotivity Institute is really the vehicle that we work in to do trainings mostly, but we train coaches. We also train companies and individuals, entrepreneurs in basically innovation and creativity mindset, the ability to think more openly, to get more ideas better, faster, easier, and implement them more successfully. And there's many different ways we do that, many different programs we have, but that is the basic of it.
Okay.
And it's all around this basic saying right behind me here, innovate yourself first. Before you deal with a system or you deal with anything in a company that is, a structure, you have to deal with the actual human beings.
Fair enough. Well said. But, you also say that your mission is creativity and innovation training and coaching for businesses and leaders. Help me understand this and maybe give me an example.
What do you mean by an example of
something that where someone maybe you may have worked with who's actually been through creativity and innovation training?
Well, see, Ashutosh, the thing is, creativity is considered by most sources to be the most important skill in the world in business, which most businesses overlook.
Yeah.
And so there's many ways it can manifest, right? But mainly when we're doing training, we do it many different ways. We do it with specific ends in mind where they have a goal they're trying to reach, but sometimes they just simply want to train the people to think more openly and have a more flexible mindset. A lot of the time when you're working in a team, you essentially have a group of people who were trained by their parents and their schools, and they're growing up until they got to the point of working in a specific company, a specific team. It's as if they were trained to do something else than what they're doing now, right? And they're being put into a team with 10 other people or 20 other people or however many other people are in the team. Each of those people was trained and programmed differently.
Yeah.
So in order to work together and collaborate, they have to actually open their minds and be reprogrammed and retrained to think differently again. Okay. And that is really ultimately what we're doing. We're talking about training people to be more creative. It's really just being more flexible, being more adaptable, being able to think more freely and not be stuck in the thought patterns that you might get stuck in, right? I'm sure if you think about yourself, you get into patterns, you get into routines. When you go home from some place, you always take the same streets to get there. If someone tells you that street's closed, it's a bit of a crisis to think, oh no, I have to figure out a new way to go, right? That is what we're trying to do, is to get people across the bridge of actually there's a lot of ways to do this, not just the way you think of. So we're looking at getting people to shift how they think about this.
I got it. And how do you differentiate between innovation and creativity?
That's a great question. Right? The simplest way to deal with that is that creativity is about thinking and innovation is about action. Now, I like to define creativity as thinking differently from yourself. Because you, Ashutosh, might be highly creative. You might be a very, very creative thinker, but if you're always creative in exactly the same way, then that is not going to help you when you face certain challenges that don't fit that way of thinking. Right. So being creative is about thinking differently from yourself. And in that case, innovation is really just acting differently from yourself, right? So obviously people consider innovation to often be tied to a specific output or a specific product, but to me, it's about the action you take to get that product.
Well said, well said. And Michael, what are some of the common myths or misconceptions about creativity that you may have come across?
Oh, there's so many. Hey? There's actually a couple books written about this. Yeah, there's a couple of great books about the myths around creativity.
Mhm.
The most common myth is probably that I'm not that creative, right? Like
Okay.
many people, do you consider yourself a creative person? You probably do.
Mhm.
Yeah, but
I do.
most people, a lot of people, even people that consider themselves creative often rank themselves like at a 4 out of 10
Mhm.
and say they're average, which is weird because that's not average, right?
Mhm.
So, number one myth, I'm not creative. Everyone is born creative. That's how we learn as children.
Mhm.
In fact, they have a study showing that 98% of children at the age of 5 are creative geniuses,
Mhm.
and almost all of us have lost that creative genius by the time we grew up.
Mhm.
So we have, that number one myth. Number two myth, you can't learn creativity. You're either creative or not. Completely false.
Mhm.
In a sense, you don't really need to learn creativity at all because you already are creative. What you need to do is unlearn uncreativity, right? You need to
Okay.
unlearn the habits and the patterns and the things that you've put in the way of being
Right.
creative, right? So that's the second thing. A third myth that comes up a lot is that that it's necessary to be unhappy or miserable, or that creativity is difficult,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
We have the images of famous artists in history like Vincent van Gogh, or
Mhm.
people who are considered to have been very depressed and
Mhm.
unhappy people. But the fact is that creativity is, it's in its nature, it is in fact a positive emotion. It is only driven by positive emotions. And if to be creative, you need to be happy. You actually need to be positive. And the best way to be creative is shift into being creative quickly, is simply to improve your mood, right? And those people like Van Gogh, who were not happy people, you'll find that they were very happy when they were doing creative work. A fourth myth of creativity, and probably the most damaging one, is that people think it's about something like painting, like Van Gogh. Creativity has nothing to do with art. It simply is what is used in art. Creativity is not art, right? Creativity is the process of thinking differently, and it is used in every aspect of human existence. In fact, human beings, that's kind of like the number one thing human beings do, is be creative, right? If you compare us to other animals, we are creative. That's what we do.
Yeah.
So to say creativity, people start thinking about painting or dancing or whatever. It's not the case. That is one aspect of what creativity is used for, but it's also used for, making a podcast or running a company, or scientific discoveries. It is used it's used when you get up in the morning and decide, why did you put on that yellow shirt instead of a blue shirt that, like, I'm wearing. Like, those are all aspects, really, to bottom line, is those are the aspects of creativity across the board. Every single part of your life is creative.
Well said. What a great response. Thank you. I love these 4 myths of creativity and the way you've handled them. My next question, Michael, is how do factors like culture or leadership influence an individual or a team's creativity?
Well, it's fairly well known that the culture of a company can stifle creativity very quickly.
Yeah.
If a company doesn't encourage creative thinking, for example, they don't like it to be wrong or make mistakes. If you can't make mistakes, you're going to struggle to be creative, right? All successful creative acts were mistakes first. Nobody got it right the first time, right? So if a company penalizes you for mistakes, that culture is going to be uncreative. If a company likes to criticize ideas before they even get out of the people's mouths, and they're really just immediately telling you what's wrong with it, that's a bad culture for creativity. If a company is not giving you like time and space, they're always rushing you to get results, then you're not going to have space and time to play with things and be creative. So culture is critical. On the other hand, culture itself will never solve the problem.
Correct.
No matter how supportive a culture is for creativity, if you don't address the individuals and help the individuals become more creative, that culture will not support successful innovation by itself, right? But it is important that the culture support the ability of people to be more creative, which is the important thing I've mentioned. Right? And around leadership, same thing. The leaders of a company have to encourage people to be creative by, and it's much more common today. So it's good, because there's been a shift from the old days where it was sort of top-down leadership, right, to a much more flexible leadership style into much more participation by employees and so on in the actual functioning of things. So it's really good because top-down leadership, control-based leadership, military-style leadership does not encourage creativity, right? In fact, obviously, that kind of military-style leadership, you don't want a military to be creative most of the time. You want them to follow the orders they're given. However, there's a really interesting quote from one general around the shifting of the way the military works over the last 30 years or so that said, when, it had to do with, I believe it was the Black Hawk Down incident where, things just went awry and they couldn't possibly know what was happening. He said, when you get into the situation, right, the situation isn't what you expected, don't follow orders, follow the order we should have given you. Right? And that's the kind of leadership we need in creativity is, look, do what you're supposed to do, but if that doesn't work, do something else.
Well said. And how, in your opinion, is technology, which is now everywhere and everyone's using different forms of AI, AR, VR, and all the other kinds of technologies, how is technology impacting creativity and innovation?
Technology has historically always improved creativity. Always. I mean, it just makes it more possible to do more things. So there's a bit of a fear around AI that somehow it's going to take away our creativity, but it actually, I mean, it does two things, right? Technology, first of all, puts creativity in more hands. So I'm from the film industry. 100 years ago, the only way you could make a film, you had to work your way up from a low position, finally be given the opportunity to have some of that extremely expensive equipment and people who knew how to use it. Now people can make, I mean, not even now, like 10 years ago already or whatever, people were making feature films on their iPhones. And no longer is the access to that the problem. The problem becomes the actual creativity, the actual ability to tell the story. And it's the same with AI now. There's a lot of things AI is doing around text and images right now that give us the opportunity to create, I don't know, like a beautiful background behind us on a podcast. Or, I created this logo thing here from my designers made it, but I can shift it, move it around, whatever, in 30 seconds. And I can write a book using AI. Now, if I just let the AI write the book, it's going to suck. I've tried this out. I've really tried it out. It ends up really bad because it doesn't have an understanding of what it's actually saying. It's only spitting out things that it's learning from what it researches. So, but as a research tool, as a way to give you access to save time and energy, looking for information, coming up with basic ideas for like a list of ideas, it saves you so much time and energy that it gives us more space to be creative. And that is where technology, the number two thing, right? So access, number one, but number two, it gives us time and space to actually put our focus on what we do, which is be creative.
Well said, well said. And Michael, what role does emotional intelligence play? You did say it's important for people to be happy, to be creative, but what role does emotional intelligence play in creativity and innovation?
It plays a big role. There's three kinds of intelligence that are getting monitored very heavily over the past 100 years, right? There's first IQ, which we know, which was about 100 years ago that was devised as a test to figure out how intelligent people are. Right? Then there's EQ from the 1970s. And then there's now AQ, or adaptability quotient, which measures how adaptable and flexible you are. All three of those are critical and important to creativity. Unfortunately, the smarter you are, the more creative you can be. It doesn't mean that you are. There's a lot of smart people who aren't, behaving creatively. But the more intelligent you are, the more easily you can shift your thinking, right? If you choose to.
Right.
It's the same with emotional intelligence. The more emotionally intelligent you are, the more able you're going to be to, shift your thinking to other spaces than you're in. And that is creativity, right? The other thing is, if you're doing a creative act of any kind, ideally you're speaking to an audience, whether it's writing a book or whether it's making a product, right? Or writing a podcast. You shouldn't be caring about what you think, right? Ashutosh, you're caring about your listeners or your viewers, what they think and what they need. Now, for that, you need emotional intelligence, right? So your ability to be creative in a useful way, to innovate something in a way that's going to have an impact on people, that emotional intelligence is critically important, right? And then that third piece I said about the adaptability, is obviously very important too. So all three of those types of things that are ranked and sort of like figured out now with scales, all those three are really important.
Well said. Michael, the next few questions are relating to the Innotivity Institute. My question is, how do you encourage clients to take risks and embrace uncertainty in the process of innovating?
That is one of the hardest things to do. It's a great question because it's a very hard thing to do. But so number one, it depends on the client. Because some clients do that anyway, right? And they're very excited to do it. Interestingly, some of the ones you think are going to do it, like I worked with an advertising agency once, and I thought they would be like easily on it. They were very difficult to take risks. They wanted to do things the way they're used to. But there's also individuals in every team. So some individuals will be more willing to take risks and others not. The easiest way to get them to do that is to make it not serious. If they think it's connected to their job and their performance, people don't tend to want to take risks unless they already do want to take risks, in which case, no problem. But if they're not wanting to take risks, the easiest way to get them to take risks is to make it play, to make it fun, to make it seem like it doesn't matter, which is, luckily, a great way to get people to be more creative, right? Play makes us creative. One of the basic principles of creative problem solving is there's 4 basic principles to generating ideas. One of them is generate as many ideas as possible. Now, in generating as many ideas as possible, if you're too serious, if you don't want to take risks, you're in trouble, right? You're not going to get a lot of ideas. You're going to come up with the one that you think is good and then be like, cool, I'm good. But if you want to generate lots of ideas, one of the best techniques for it is actually called reverse brainstorming, or world's worst idea technique, which is come up with the worst solutions for this problem you can possibly come up with. Right? And if you are serious about something, if you don't want to take risks, that game is a great way to get you to do it, because then it's a game. It's like, just think of the worst idea. Don't try to think of a good idea. And now everybody can think of bad ideas, right? But you'd be surprised that some people don't think of bad enough ideas. Like we want astoundingly bad ideas, right? In that game. And that can help you trigger 50, 100, ideas to come out. So you can choose 2 or 3 that work.
Well said. And are there any industries or sectors who you feel are in dire need of more innovation or more innovative approaches?
All of them.
Okay.
Yeah, all of them. Everybody needs more innovation.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
The next 2 questions I have are for you personally. Given your amazing 20 years in the film industry, my question is, how has your background supported your coaching philosophy, your style, and your values?
I think for me, the idea, again, this thing here next to me, innovate yourself. It comes very much from, when you ask about the film industry, my background in storytelling, we all are a story. And it's a story that we have told. And, unfortunately, we believe our story most of the time. So when we get into situations where we want to be more flexible, we don't believe we can be, because we believe that the story about ourselves we've told is true, and we forgot that we told the story. We somehow think that it's a true story that was given to us to read, but it's actually a story we wrote. And so innovating yourself becomes much more easy when you remember that you wrote the story, right? And when we talk about that myth that everyone's not creative, that's the number one piece right there. You created yourself. So how can you not be creative? I mean, the number one most impressive thing you'll ever do is create Ashutosh. You've done that. And you can do it again and again, actually. You don't have to stop now just because you're 20 years old or 30 years old or 50 years old. You can keep creating and recreating, right? So that's, I think, what I would say I learned from the film industry mostly is that stories are just stories, and you can write them a different way.
Fascinating. So 2 more questions for you now. Most of us, Michael, have people who have influenced us in our lives, who have shaped us in our lives. My question is, how have you been shaped by people in your life, and how are they influencing you as a coach today?
You've asked me that question at an interesting time. Yesterday, a person very close to me, I found out, passed away last week.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
I know when you broadcast this, it won't be the same week, but I literally found out last night, and he's part of a collective of people in an organization called Landmark that does certain kind of transformational work. Actually, in India, a lot of people do Landmark, but he and I are both leaders in that work, and it's around transformation, and it's made a big impact. But he was, his name was Inayat. He was one of the most generous spirited people that myself or many other people can imagine have ever met. He gave of himself to others in an immense way, and I could never imagine myself being as generous as he is. But what I can say is, when you ask that question, that right now, today, that's what I'm thinking of, because he went out of his way to be there for other people in a way that made him a leader.
Right.
And it's the kind of experience, like he was my buddy. Like every week we had a call to discuss things. He was like literally, functionally, formally a buddy in a structure with me. And we were in a group right now, in a training we were in right now, and he didn't show up to the last one, and we were all wondering what happened. And then we found out, but
wow.
Why I bring him up when you ask the question is that leadership is often misunderstood, I think, and I certainly misunderstand it, that You're supposed to go out and do something tremendous, or you're supposed to go out and do something that people can follow. But what Inayat did was, each and every interaction he had with people, whether it was 1 or 20 or 100, he cared about everybody, and he wanted everybody to be their best. And that to me is
amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this with us. Michael, my last question to you, and this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation or view our conversation. Based on your amazing understanding of innovation and creativity, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want a lot of our young viewers and listeners to take away?
Sure, Ashutosh. Sorry, I'm a little bit.
I know you spoke about your friend, and we can.
The first thing I would say is, like I said, you created yourself. So let us never hear. I mean, let me put it this way: if a child had the mind of an adult, she would never learn to walk.
Wow.
Right? If you took your head now and put it on your baby head when you were learning to walk, you'd still be sitting on the floor and sucking your thumb and going like, "This is not for me, this walking thing." Because I've fallen down 50 times. So number one is, like, whatever you want to do, whatever you're aiming to do, you can do, and especially if it has to do with how you are.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the first thing. You created yourself, you can recreate yourself. The second thing I would say, give me a big task, three profound things.
Whatever, if you're comfortable, two is okay also.
I'll come up with 3. The second thing is that creativity doesn't exist only in your mind, even though it's all about thought. Creativity happens in interaction with the world and with others. Collaboration is where creativity really happens. Very, very few examples exist outside of writing, kind of, like people that write novels kind of do it alone, but they also have editors, and they also have readers that they're talking to, and so on. And I'd say the third thing I would say is what I said earlier. If you want to be creative, just the easiest way to be more creative right now, the simplest way is to be happy. If you're positive, if you're happy, if you have a positive energy, if you're optimistic, if you think the glass is half full, not half empty, whatever it's full of, whether it's whiskey or milk, doesn't matter. What it matters is that the positive mindset, a positive feeling, will give you a more creative thinking. And they say there's 5 human emotions, right? I think it's anger, sadness, disgust. Can't remember the 4th one, but then the 5th one is, anger, sadness, disgust, fear, and joy. So of those 5, only 1, joy, is positive, right? So that's kind of like weird. Either Ashutosh, I guess the last thought I'll leave you with, either we are disgusting creatures where 4 out of 5 of our emotions are negative, or joy is so powerful that it can balance out 4 times its weight.
Absolutely right. Well said.
Right. So let's
Michael,
go with that.
Yeah. And on that note, Michael, and your 3 wonderful lessons, you can do it, or as Nike slogan says, just do it. Second, you said creativity happens in interaction with the world. And the third you said was be happy to be creative. Thank you so much for talking to me about your own journey. Thank you for talking to me about so many different aspects of creativity and innovation. Thank you for sharing in such detail the 4 myths of creativity. I think a lot of our viewers and listeners would love to go into much more detail about these 4 myths because they're so real and they're so easy to understand as well. And thank you also for speaking to me a little bit about the coaching work that you're doing and what makes you motivated enough to be able to do what you're doing. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much, Ashutosh, and good luck to you with your next podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.